Questions orales, oral questions. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are outraged, and rightly so. Statistics Canada wants to look into honest Canadians' banking records. For us at the Conservative Party, this is totally unacceptable. There's no place for this intrusion in Canada. But unfortunately, the Liberal government is washing their hands of this and saying there's no problem, they can keep doing what they want to do. Fortunately, the Privacy Commissioner has started an investigation. Why is the Liberal government continuing to defend the undefensible? The Honourable Minister for Infrastructure. I thank my colleague, the member for Louis Saint Laurent. Our government takes privacy very seriously. Working with confidential data is not anything new for Statistics Canada, of course. For the last century, StatsCan has been using personal data to provide relevant and useful data to individuals, companies, and communities. In the spirit of transparency, they even invited the Privacy Commissioner to work more closely with them on this project. We understand that he has accepted this invitation. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, it's much more than an invitation. It's an investigation. Why are they having this investigation? Well, it certainly doesn't make any sense what they're doing. This is an intrusion into Canadians' privacy. Now, to paraphrase a former Minister of Justice, if the state has nothing to do in people's bedrooms, the state has no business in their bank accounts either. Why is the government still tolerating this situation? This is enough. They need to stop it. The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, what's intolerable for Canadians is the fear-mongering campaigns of the Conservatives. That's what Canadians find intolerable and have for years. Statistics Canada is dealing with personal data that was collected, or this data that is collected will be used anonymously, and Canadians can be assured that their banking account information will be protected. When data is collected, all personal markers are withdrawn from it. Canadians know what StatsCan does, and the Conservatives would do well to stop this fear-mongering campaign.
Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the data that Stats Canada is demanding is not anonymous, it's personal, and it is private. They have no consent from Canadians to take it. It includes account balances, debit and credit transactions, mortgage payments, e-transfers, all taken from Canadians without their consent. Now, we on this side of the House are not going to trust this government to protect Canadians when they violated it so many times before. Why don't they do the right thing and tell Statistics Canada to back off the private personal information of Canadians?
Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, on this side of the House, we do trust Statistics Canada, and we do trust Canadians to make the right judgment. Statistics Canada, Mr. Speaker, has been handling Canadian personal information for hundreds of years now. The data they receive will be scrapped of all personal information when they receive it, so Canadians can be assured that their banking information are protected and private. Following best practices, Statistics Canada has gone above the requirements of the law and asked the financial institution to inform the clients of how this data will be used. The Conservatives would do well to listen to Statistics Canada.
Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Mr. Speaker, there have been over 800 pages with hundreds of thousands of examples of where this government has violated the privacy of Canadians in the last 19 months alone, so he'll forgive us if we don't trust him with the personal financial data of Canadians. They have no consent to obtain it. This is private personal data. Why don't they tell Statistics Canada to get out of the bank accounts of Canadians?
Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, we have no lessons to receive from the Conservative, and Canadians know that, Mr. Speaker. High-quality, reliable data is key in making decisions that truly reflect the needs of Canadians. Unlike the Conservative, we think that facts are a pretty good place to start to make public policy. Mr. Speaker, Canadians, they know who they can trust in this country. They can trust Statistics Canada, they can trust us to do the right thing, and the Conservative better get on board.
Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope. Order.
Mr. Speaker, this government seems to have a problem with understanding the concept of of consent. They do not have it in this case. They don't have the right to the personal data of Canadians. They have violated the privacy of Canadians hundreds of thousands of times in the last 19 months alone. Why don't they listen to Canadians who are outraged by this personal violation? Stop Stats Canada from accessing their financial data and do it today.
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, what we're going to start doing is to trust Statistics Canada, and they should be doing that, Mr. Speaker, because Canadians know that Statistics Canada is on their side. Mr. Speaker, we know that data is a good place to start to make policy decisions in this country, and I think Canadians told that to the Conservative the last election, Mr. Speaker. They know they can trust Statistics Canada. They know they can trust us. We will treat the information in accordance with the law, and they better get on board with it.
Order. There's somebody serving chocolate in the lobbies from last night's Halloween. What's going on? L'honorable à l'ordre.
Order. The Honourable Member for Rimouski, Neigette-Témiscouata-Basque.
When it comes to fighting climate change, this Liberal government is all talk and little action. So little action, in fact, that a group of Quebec's legal experts is considering bringing this government to court to force it to respect its own commitments. This recourse is seen as plausible because it has been used elsewhere, namely in the Netherlands. In a court ruling, the Dutch government is now under obligation to implement a GHG reduction plan. Will the Liberals stop producing so much hot air about climate change, or will they wait for the legal experts to force them to do it?
The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I think some colleagues will agree it's not in this part of the House of Commons that there's hot air being produced with respect to climate change. Mr. Speaker, what our government is doing is putting forward a real plan that will make a real difference in the global fight against climate change. We've said in the 2015 election, Mr. Speaker, we would have a plan, something the Conservatives don't have. We said, Mr. Speaker, we would put a price on pollution and make the Canadian economy more competitive and create jobs for middle-class Canadians. That's exactly what our government is doing.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski, Neigette-Témiscouata-Basque. Well, if they're so serious, Mr. Speaker, why are they still using Stephen Harper's inadequate targets which they're even going to miss? These failures have consequences. Over the last 25 years, the Earth's oceans have absorbed 60% more heat than scientists initially thought. Mr. Speaker, this means that climate warming is further advanced than we thought. It also means that in the Antarctic, Pine Island Glacier lost a section of ice that was 300 kilometers square in area. That's 5 times the size of Manhattan. Why are the Liberals refusing to change their game plan, which clearly isn't working? The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, it won't be a surprise to you, I'm sure, that I do not share the pessimism of our honourable colleague. As we've always said, our government takes the issue of climate change very seriously, something that the Conservative Party obviously isn't interested in doing. We have a plan. We have a plan to make polluters pay. And at the same time, it is a plan that will ensure the competitiveness of the Canadian economy, job creation for Canadians, and we're continuing with that plan.
In Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians grow increasingly fearful of daily reports that impacts of climate change are worsening beyond what scientists have predicted, that our oceans have absorbed 60% more heat than predicted, that the Arctic is melting at a frighteningly rapid rate, that we can expect worsening floods and drought. Pressure is building for measures to hold our governments accountable. Today I tabled a motion to legally enact binding greenhouse gas targets, impose a duty to act, and measures to ensure improved accountability and transparency for federal action to mitigate climate change. Will this government support my motion, M204?
The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I do share our honourable colleague's sense of urgency in terms of the fight against climate change. She correctly identified a series of global phenomena that all Canadians are concerned about and have asked their governments to take seriously. They ask their governments to act in a serious way to ensure that we have a plan to fight climate change. Mr. Speaker, we think an essential element of that plan is not to make pollution free, something the Conservatives think would be a key part of a plan. Mr. Speaker, we'll make the Canadian economy more competitive and fight climate change at the same time.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, we've learned today that cleaning up the mess and waste from the oil sands will cost us at least $260 billion. That's billion. That's a hefty bill for pollution. In the Netherlands, the courts forced the government to step up its efforts against climate change. Legal experts in Quebec want to do the same thing and take the Canadian government to court. When you have to take the Liberals to court to get them to take real steps to fight climate change, things must be pretty bad. Is that what the Liberals are waiting for, to be taken to court? The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, for the last few years, in fact, even before that anyone was threatening lawsuits, we've shown that we would take climate change seriously. We have a plan that Canadians understand and that they know will make a real difference in the fight against climate change. I would remind my honourable colleague that the province of Quebec, his province, is a leader in the fight against climate change and has been for a very long time. They also have one of the most competitive economies in Canada.
Central Okanagan's Milkmean Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are refusing to listen to Canadians who are outraged that the government is engaged in unauthorized surveillance of their every financial transaction. Even if the government could guarantee that this data could not fall into the hands of hackers, which they can't, it would still be an abuse of power to collect it. Now, this is about the principle that the state doesn't get to monitor everything that people do. Why are the Liberals so out of touch, Mr. Speaker, and when will they put a halt to this unwarranted this surveillance, Mr. Speaker? It's important to Canadians. When?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear on this matter. The information Statistics Canada wishes to study is entirely within Section 13 of the Statistics Act. And how many times, Mr. Speaker, did Statistics Canada use this section when these very same Conservatives were in power? Not once, Mr. Speaker, not twice, not even a dozen times, but 84 times, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in 2008, a major credit card agency signed an agreement with StatsCan to provide this type of financial data for statistical purposes. Mr. Speaker, we trust Statistics Canada. We trust their ability to deal.
Honourable Member for Central Okanagan,
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about millions of transactions that could affect potentially millions of Canadians that we don't know. It could be me, it could be you, Mr. Speaker. Now, George Orwell wrote 1984 as a warning, not as a roadmap. Canadians deserve to be free to live their lives without the state monitoring every single purchase they make. Now, the Canadian people are quite concerned that every time they will spend money, it will be documented and tracked by the state. Will this government end this unauthorized surveillance of Canadians, Mr. Speaker?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, enough of this fear-mongering from the Conservatives. Statistics Canada is a respected agency. It's respected in Canada and around the world. The data that they receive, Mr. Speaker, will be scrubbed so that all of the personal information from it will be removed before it is made in any way available, compiled, etc., for the use of governments, of Canadians, of businesses, of small businesses across Canada. Mr. Speaker, following best practices, Statistics Canada has gone above and beyond the requirements, and they've consulted the Privacy Commissioner and are going to work with him to make sure that the interests of Canadians are not breached.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix. When it comes to confidentiality, Canadians expect that their government will protect their information, first and foremost. The data requested by Statistics Canada is not anonymous, it's private and personal. But Statistics Canada is asking for it without anyone's consent. Why is the party across the way trying to get Canadians' information on their financial transactions without their consent? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as I just said in English, the information that Statistics Canada wants to study falls under Section 13 of the Statistics Act. Personal information, the personal information that will be studied and collected by StatsCan, will be scrubbed, Mr. Speaker, and rendered anonymous. So the government will not have access to personal information. Statistics Canada is respected across Canada and around the world, and we trust their judgment.
Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau once quipped that there was no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. This Prime Minister seems to think that the personal, financial details of the nation, on the other hand, are fair game. Why is that Prime Minister so out of touch with Canadians who don't want this unauthorized surveillance to continue?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous Conservative government, we think facts are a good place to start in terms of the development of policy and public policy, and not ideology, Mr. Speaker, which is how that government based its decisions. Unlike the Conservative Party, we're a fan of the facts, and therefore Statistics Canada will be empowered to collect this kind of information, anonymize it, Mr. Speaker, in order to protect the private information of Canadians, and then Canadians across Canada will be able to use this information, small businesses, large businesses, as well as governments, to develop good policy and practices.
Honourable Member for Peace River Westlaw.
One of the ideals of the Conservative Party is that we would ask people if before that we take their information. Canadians are outraged by the Liberals' unauthorized surveillance of their private banking information, and my constituents have been calling me worried about the Liberals snooping into their bank accounts. Right. This government has already acquired 15 years of credit information from millions of Canadians without their consent, Mr. Speaker. Now the Privacy Commissioner of Canada is investigating abuse. When will the Liberals stop snooping into the lives of Canadians?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, from the get-go, the Chief Statistician of Canada has been open to working with the Privacy Commissioner to make sure that the private information of Canadians was not placed at risk. Mr. Speaker, I find it a little rich that the Conservatives make themselves the defendants of Canadians' privacy. We should remind them of their history. They're the same Conservative Party that were forced to back down when they, not Statistics Canada, Mr. Speaker, their government went after Canadians' personal information online. This is the same Conservative Party that leaked medical information of a veteran Canadian. Enough of this fake outrage, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
Mr. Speaker, when I heard on the news on the weekend about this stats scam, I thought this just can't be true, Mr. Speaker, because we live in Canada, not the Soviet Union. But after listening to the minister responsible for the gulag over there, Mr. Speaker, I'm not so sure we're not in the Soviet Union. Now, this minister just said here today that Canadians better get on board. So I'll tell you what, Mr. Speaker, yesterday I surveyed my constituents. In one day, over 1,000 responses. And you know what they said? 98% of them said, get out of my life, not get on board. So I'd like to ask the minister.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to hear the side opposite try to defend the private life of Canadians and quote former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau when he said the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. It's unfortunate that many people in their party still disagree with that today.
Then you have
Order.
Député de Jean.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, the TPP will come into force in 59 days, and dairy farmers still don't know what kind of compensation they're going to get. It's unbelievable. When they signed the TPP, the Liberals conceded 3.25% of our supply-managed market. After similar concessions in CETA and the USMCA, it's no surprise that producers are angry. They're tired of being treated like pawns. Will the government finally compensate our farmers for all of their losses?
The Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question. We understand there will be an impact on farmers, and we're committed to fully and fairly supporting them and to make sure that they succeed. We are forming working groups with the dairy producers and processors, poultry and egg producers and processors. Together, we will help our supply management farmers and processors innovate, grow, and remain competitive for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, we have and will continue to support the agricultural sector and the supply management sector.
Honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé.
Times the Liberals had a chance to protect supply management, and guess what? 3 times they failed. The Liberals had signed deals that opened up more than 10% of our dairy market. The effects of these policies are hard and they hurt families. Hardworking families are feeling betrayed by the Liberals. The Liberals have used our supply-managed farms as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations, and we must know more about this, Mr. Speaker. Can the Vice Chair of the Agriculture Committee tell the House whether the TPP and the lack of compensation for farmers will be on the agenda in the next coming days? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just a minute. Order. A question can certainly be asked of the chair of a committee if the chair is here, and if the chair is not here, then the vice chair can be asked. If the chair of the committee is present, he can answer. If not, then we'll go to the honourable member for Cowichan.
The Standing Committee on Agriculture is currently engaged in a study on the mental health challenges that farmers, ranchers, and producers face. During the course of that study, we have heard repeated testimony from supply-managed farmers about the mental health challenges they're facing because of trade deals. The TPP comes into force 59 days from now, yet the Liberals have not introduced a compensation plan for losses in the supply-managed sector. Mr. Speaker, our farmers, ranchers, and producers...
Order. The honourable member knows that the comments from a vice chair should be on the agenda. That can be what can be talked about by a chair or vice chair in the House. Member for Carleton.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister admitted that large industrial corporations will not have a carbon tax, they will have targets. And if they exceed those targets, he said they will have to pay. So I checked what they'd have to pay, and it turns out, in the government's own documents, they will not have to pay the same tax as Canadians. In fact, they can just submit something called eligible offset credits. So if large industrial corporations don't have to pay the carbon tax, why should suburban soccer moms and small businesses have to pay it?
Mr. Speaker, you know Conservatives are getting desperate when they turn to the Fords for an endorsement. We saw it in the dying days of the 2015 campaign when Stephen Harper became a convert to the Ford Nation. Now the leader of the opposition wants to be in the same shadow as well. Canadians deserve an honest plan to deal with climate change. We have a plan that will protect our environment and create good jobs for middle-class Canadians. We wish the Conservatives had one as well.
Well, the question was about the carbon tax. The government has released documents that show that industrial facilities that emit more than 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases will be exempt from the carbon tax. If the carbon tax really was about saving the world, you presume the largest industrial emitters of carbon would have to pay it. But so the question again, why should small businesses and suburban soccer moms pay it if large emitters don't have to?
Mr. Speaker, we saw yesterday another example of what Conservative leaders do when they're in dire straits. They beg for an endorsement from the Fords. We remember Stephen Harper in the dying days of the 2015 election with a fake cash register at an event with the Fords. Now the current leader, Mr. Speaker, appears to also be taking orders from Premier Ford to ensure that there's no plan to deal with climate change and no plan to make the Canadian economy more competitive. That's not something, Mr. Speaker, that this government will do.
The honourable member for Carleton.
No, what this government will do is charge a new exorbitant tax on small businesses, suburban commuters, and soccer moms while giving an exemption to large industrial facilities that emit more than 50,000 tons of greenhouse gases. Now, they say the only way to save the world from climate change is a tax, yet they're exempting the largest industrial emitters of greenhouse gases. So again, if they're going to exempt the big corporations, why don't they exempt families and small businesses too?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we were elected on a commitment to grow the economy and protect the environment at the same time. Our plan includes putting a price on pollution that will leave middle-class families better off. It's interesting that the Conservatives have finally found the courage to stand up for the middle class, which they've been lacking for several years. When it came to small business owners, we reduced the small business tax to 9%, which they opposed. We implemented the Canada Child Benefit, which leaves 9 of 10 families better off, and we're taking steps to make life more affordable for seniors. Mr. Speaker, I'd encourage them to continue to advocate what we've been advocating for several years, which is to support the middle class, and if they develop a plan to support the environment at the same time, I'll be happy.
Honourable member for Carleton.
Well, that's the same question 3 times in a row, and 3 times they've scattered off running to every other subject conceivable. They cannot explain why large industrial emitters, the largest that emit more than 50,000 tons of greenhouse gases, don't have to pay the carbon tax at all, when the tax is supposed to be about reducing emissions. Only suburban soccer moms, small businesses, and seniors have to pay it. Why?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, the honourable member is distorting the facts. Our plan to protect the environment includes putting a price on pollution, including a price for heavy emitters. We also know, not only from our government, but from folks like Stephen Harper's former Director of Policy, that middle-class families will be better off as a result of this plan. In fact, Doug Ford's chief budget advisor confirmed 2 years ago before the Senate that, in fact, the single most important thing we can do to transition to a low-carbon economy is to put a price on pollution. I suggest that the Conservatives actually take his advice. Their only plan when they were in government was to plunge us into a recession, and they liked it so much they tried it twice.
Honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, Audrey Parker of Halifax is dying today. She has stage 4 cancer and lives in terrible pain. She's chosen to end her life much sooner than she would like. Audrey was forced to make this agonizing choice because our existing medical assistance in dying law doesn't allow for advanced requests. She worried that if she waited, she wouldn't be able to give the consent required. Soon the government's receiving an expert report on this law. Will it introduce legislation before the next election so people like Audrey never again have to make this agonizing choice?
Minister of Health.
I'd like to stand in this House and give my sincere condolences to the family of Miss Parker. If I could have given her authorization for advance request, I would have absolutely done so. But as parliamentarians, we know that the laws that we make are for all Canadians. That's why we put in place a group of experts to look at 3 sensitive areas as we want to protect our vulnerable Canadians. We want them to look at the issue involving advance consent, also the issue of mature minors, and also for serious mental health issues. Once again, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work on this matter, and I look forward to receiving the experts' report. Thank you.
The member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, as with the NDP, Amnesty International, Oxfam, and several other organizations have asked the government to immediately cease selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. The Liberals have been repeating for years that they are deeply concerned, that they are following the situation closely, but Canadians are sick and tired of waiting. We cannot put a price on human rights. So will the government finally walk the talk and suspend the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect that our exports are not used to violate human rights. This is why our government is committed to a stronger and rigorous arms export system, and we are reviewing our export permits to Saudi Arabia. We have suspended permits in the past. We will not hesitate to do so again if the facts warrant it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this summer when I was knocking on doors in my riding of Vaughan Woodbridge, I talked with my residents about the issues they were concerned about. For most of them, they were concerned about the economy, the cost of raising their kids, and about saving for their retirement. Lors des élections de
During the 2015 election, we stated clearly that we intended to focus on investing in Canada's middle class to strengthen our economy. Can the Minister of Finance tell the House about the measures we have taken to help Canadian families and to grow our economy? The Honourable Minister.
Thank the member from Vaughan Woodbridge, not only for the question, but for the work that he's doing to listen to Canadians and on the Finance Committee to help us drive the right kind of investments for Canada. Ce que je peux dire, nos investments.
What I can say is that our investments have already made a huge difference to Canadian families across the country.
Is unemployment rates at among the 40-year lows. We're seeing a level of growth that's helping families across the country. And importantly, for constituents in Vaughan Woodbridge and across the country, we're going to see $2,000 more in their pockets in 2019 versus what they had in 2015. A really important difference for middle-class Canadians.
The member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister loves making good news announcements, but he never talks about the details. He's got a new immigration plan, but he forgot to consult and provide additional resources to CBSA agents whose workload is increasing because of irregular arrivals. Shouldn't the problem be solved? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as opposed to the previous government, which cut $400 million from the CBSA, we've invested $173 million, and this way we will be better able to manage the situation and ensure that the people who were turned back, asylum seekers whose claim was rejected, will be sent back. This is what Quebecers expect, and this is exactly what we are doing. The member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the numbers are changing. 300 million, 100 million, it's all false. CBSA agents have learned through the media that they will have to deport more people, but they don't have enough resources to do so. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of resources, because everything is being mismanaged right now. So the question is, are you able to deport those 10,000 people, yes or no? I would ask the member to please direct his questions at the Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, yes, we are ready. We are ready because we invested after the former government of Stephen Harper cut $400 million. Yes, we are able to manage the situation. We've put the money in place. There are people working hard on the border to manage the irregular migrants, and they are able to do their work, these guards, thanks to our investments.
Spending, Mr. Speaker. After spending hundreds of millions of Canadian tax dollars on processing and prioritizing things like work permits for people who illegally entered Canada after reaching the safety of upstate New York, today the Prime Minister announced that he was starting a taxpayer-funded propaganda campaign to moralize with his false sanctimony to Canadians who oppose his failed immigration policies. How many taxpayer dollars will the Prime Minister be spending on his advertising campaign to preach the value of illegal border crossers to Canadians?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we were proud to put in place yesterday our second 3-year immigration plan that will see immigrants to this country rise over the next number of years. That will contribute to the economic success of our country. That will contribute to jobs for middle-class Canadians. We believe that newcomers to Canada contribute to the economic success of our country. It's a principle that the Conservatives do not believe in. They believe in spreading fear and division and dog-whistling at Canadians. We will grow the economy. We will bring newcomers into Canada, and they will contribute to the economic vitality of our great country.
Honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
The best way to build support for immigration in Canada is to fix the system that this Prime Minister has broken. To build support for immigration, the Prime Minister should close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement instead of spending $50 million to foot the hotel bills of illegal border crossers. Why is the Prime Minister adding insult to injury by spending taxpayer dollars to tell Canadians that illegal border crossing is okay instead of preventing the abuse of Canada's asylum system?
Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, we believe that it's important to share the successes that newcomers are contributing to communities right across the country. When we are proud to do so, Canadians understand that when newcomers come into their communities, they set up businesses, they provide jobs for middle-class Canadians, they help our economy grow. We will continue to focus on the economic success of our country through immigration. It's rich for the party opposite to talk about immigration in positive terms after they failed. They failed on the immigration front for close to 10 years. We believe in economic success in our country, growth for the middle class, and that happens through increased immigration.
Order. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Instead of going after fat cat CEOs and the tax havens wealthy corporations use to avoid paying their fair share, refugees are having their child benefit clawed back. The government failed to provide timely access to language training for many of the new arrivals. Yet refugee families who do not respond quickly to the CRA are penalized immediately. Not only are those payments stopped, in 2 cases, refugee families were billed $27,000. Is that why the government's giving the CRA $1 billion to crack down on the middle class and those who are working hard to join?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of National Revenue.
Mr. Speaker, our government has enhanced the Canada Child Benefit, which give money to 9 out of the 10 families that have lifted thousands of children out of poverty. We're aware that sometimes individuals may find it difficult to provide the information that's requested for the review of their file. If obtaining documentation poses a problem, different alternatives adapted to the particular situation of the individual can be proposed. The agency is open to discuss and propose options. We have said many times our priority is for Canadians to get the benefits they're entitled to. Thank you.
The member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, researchers at the University of Quebec and Montreal have discovered that out of 5,500 movies and series, Netflix features a grand total of 5 series and 5 movies produced in Quebec. That's 0.1% of Netflix's content. We're really nowhere to be seen. Quebec producers recently said that the Netflix agreement has done nothing for our culture. What we need to do is produce movies and series in Quebec. If the next generation of Quebecers can't watch its own shows, it'll turn to American shows and watch in English. What will the minister do to address the situation?
We'll always be there for our artists and creators, and that's exactly what we demonstrated with our cultural policy last year. We've made historic investments of $3.2 billion in the cultural sector, including in the CBC, the Canada Council for the Arts, Telefilm, the NFB, the Canada Media Fund. Due to the previous Conservative government's inaction, the last decade, our laws on culture predate the internet, which is why we're reviewing them so that we can continue to support high-quality Canadian content production. The principle of this review is clear. If you participate in the system, you'll contribute to the system. There will be no free rides.
Bravo. The honourable member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the chair of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Mr. Speaker, it is a crime to destroy government documents under the Access to Information Act. That crime is much more egregious if those documents have been requested in a legal proceeding. Mr. Chair, can can the chair of the committee advise the House and all Canadians if the future agenda of the committee will include the destruction of government-held documents?
The honourable chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Thornhill for that question. As the member may know, the motion brought forward by the opposition members of our Ethics Committee today that would have ensured documents and information related to Project Resolve not to be destroyed, that motion was voted down by Liberal members. Defeated 6-3. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Durham.
Admiral Mark Norman's legal team are worried about his constitutional rights to a fair trial. Multiple Liberal ministers have conflict of interest. They hired away the one journalist writing stories about it. The Prime Minister's office is refusing to reveal cabinet documents needed for this trial. And today, Mr. Speaker, Liberal MPs blocked at Ethics Committee the ability for the clerk of the Privy Council to appear just to confirm whether documents weren't destroyed. My question's simple. Why the cover-up? What is the government hiding?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, indeed there is no cover-up. The fact of the matter is there are outstanding legal proceedings before the courts, including proceedings that will occur this very week on this very topic, and the appropriate place for those issues to be resolved are in the courts of law. The honourable members opposite do not have a mandate from either the prosecution or the defence to act in this matter. They should leave it to the legal counsel to follow the rules of court, follow the laws of evidence, and allow the case to be decided in court appropriately.
Honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, that member was first elected when I was 1 year old, and it's sad that I have to remind him that our mandate is from the Canadian people, Mr. Speaker. Admiral Mark Norman is facing criminal charges for breach of trust, a trust that the Privy Council have said that 73 people knew the contents of that meeting. Mr. Speaker, I believe that at least 2 people of those 73 are Liberal MPs, Mr. Speaker. They could be anyone. They could be you, Mr. Speaker. Leaving aside the Norman lawsuit, Mr. Speaker, will the government clear the air and release the 72 other names?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, you've just seen a demonstration why these issues should be dealt with in courts of law, so you can avoid the innuendos and the drive-by smears. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that the rules of court are there, the independent judiciary is there to manage these matters, and our distinguished law officers at the table have said very clearly when matters of sub judice, they should not be the subject of either questions or answers in the House of Commons.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, methamphetamine abuse is impacting communities across Manitoba. Manitoba's chief medical examiner stated that the drug has been involved in 35 overdose deaths in 2017. In September, the Winnipeg City Council adopted a resolution asking for assistance from the federal government. The issue is not only affecting urban centres like Winnipeg, but rural and Indigenous communities across Canada. Mr. Speaker, people are dying, and we have a responsibility to act. Can the Minister of Health please explain what our government is doing to help communities impacted by methamphetamine?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague from Manitoba for his hard work and his important question. To address the issue of problematic substance use, including methamphetamines, we have devoted $150 million to an emergency treatment fund. Furthermore, I'm pleased to advise this House that we will be providing the City of Winnipeg with assistance for prevention and treatment and send a senior official to work on their methamphetamine task force. We will keep working to remove barriers to treatment and ensure that all Canadians struggling with problematic substance use get the help that they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are failing again. They are watering down sentences for crimes such as administering date-rape drugs, abducting children, impaired driving causing bodily harm, and selling young women and men into sexual slavery. Now, Conservatives called for over 100 amendments to clean up the government's deeply flawed Omnibus Bill C-75, but the Liberals weren't listening. Does the minister really believe that Canadians want sex traffickers and kidnappers to have lesser sentences?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have to say from the outset that I completely reject the characterization of the members opposite on Bill C-75, which is a comprehensive bill that seeks to address delays in the criminal justice system. There is nothing in this piece of legislation that reduces sentences. There's nothing that changes the principles around sentencing, which take into account the gravity of the offense and the proportion responsibility of an offender. We are not lowering sentences. We are providing prosecutors with the necessary discretion that they need to move forward in the appropriate way given the circumstances of the particular case.
Honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Forced overtime at Canada Post means increased hours and longer delivery routes that take a toll on worker health and safety, and families suffer. Because of the corporation's inflexibility, CUPW is pushing back against unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. Effective today, the union has declared a national ban on overtime. Workers understand that self-care benefits them, their families, the corporation, and its customers. Why doesn't Canada Post get it? And when will this government secure a fair contract that values workers?
The Honourable Minister of Public, Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Employment.
Mr. Speaker, our government believes in the collective bargaining process. Our mediators have been on the ground. The minister has been in contact with both sides. We continue to hope that the two groups come together with a final outcome, but certainly I would hope that my colleague from the NDP would understand that it's not the place of the Government of Canada to put their thumb on the scale when it comes to contract negotiations.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Mr. Speaker, today is the YWCA Day on the Hill. The YWCA is the country's oldest and largest women's multi-service organization, with 32 associations operating in more than 400 communities across Canada.
The organization provides programs and services to women and their families in response to community needs. What is this government doing to support organizations like the YMCA who work to remove barriers for women across the country? The Honourable Minister.
From Ottawa West Nepean for her tireless efforts to advance equality in Canada and abroad. And Mr. Speaker, last year, YWCAs came to Parliament Hill for the first time ever for their lobbying efforts. They asked for a carve-out of the National Housing Strategy. Our government listened. This year, we welcomed them with an announcement of an investment over $1.25 million for 10 YWCAs in Canada to support women working hard to join the middle class. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister and parliamentarians, I extend my deepest gratitudes to leaders from the YWCA, and I wish them another successful day on the Hill.
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, under Conservatives, 4 major new pipelines with access to new markets were approved and built with no tax dollars. These Liberals already killed 2 export pipelines. Their failures have not added a single new centimetre, and their Bill C-69 will ensure there will be none in the future. 35 Indigenous communities now join provinces and industry to oppose the Liberals' No More Pipelines Bill C-69. They say it'll, quote, have an enormous and devastating impact on the ability of First Nations to cultivate or develop economic development opportunities in their traditional territories. Will Liberals scrap Bill C-69?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, after 10 years of inaction under the Harper Conservatives, 99% of our oil exports were still sold to the United States. They don't even want to negotiate with our First Nations. They have no respect for the environment. We will take no lessons from them on how to move our major projects forward. This 69 provides a path forward and a certainty that business owners need. The mining sector is on board. The forestry sector is on board. We must move forward responsibly. Merci, Mr. Président.
The member for La Pointe de l'Île. Mr. Speaker, a month ago today, Quebecers chose a new government which committed to reducing immigration levels in order to better integrate newcomers. Let me quote Premier Legault, "We will welcome thousands of immigrants each year, but we'll do so with a focus on integration. We'll take in fewer, but we'll take care of them." So what did the Minister of Immigration have in mind when he unilaterally announced that Quebec would have to take in 70,000 newcomers to Quebec? The Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank our honourable colleague for his question. Our government is looking forward to working with the new Quebec government on issues as important as immigration and how to help Quebec continue to prosper. I, in fact, just had a brief conversation with the new Minister, Simon Jolin Barrette, and I'm looking forward to meeting with the new minister in the coming days. And it's the same with my colleagues in Cabinet. We're looking forward to working with the government of Quebec. The member for Mirabel. What an empty response. Mr. Speaker, we know that the Minister of Immigration is not familiar with the reality in Quebec. We want to integrate newcomers. We don't want to just tolerate them. We want to welcome them. And to do that, we need to be able to teach them our language and our way of life. The minister announced numbers without taking into account the reality on the ground. So will the minister listen to Quebec before setting levels for Quebec? The Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I find it unfortunate that my colleague finds I gave an empty answer when I said we want to work with the government of Quebec. I'm surprised to hear those words coming from that corner of the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. Canadians would be horrified and embarrassed to see the third world conditions that many people in Nunavut are living in. Our housing shortage has reached a crisis point. Overcrowding is contributing to high rates of youth suicide and tuberculosis. The housing allocation in the last budget doesn't even begin to address the current crisis or meet annual forced growth. Will the minister immediately increase funding to alleviate this crisis and work with the government of Nunavut on an appropriate allocation for the 2019 budget? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Speaker, I would like to thank the member for Nunavut for his heartfelt question. The National Housing Strategy understands the unique and important needs of Canadians living in the North. That's why the National Housing Strategy is investing $240 million in Nunavut alone to provide 3,000 families in Nunavut with a safe and affordable place to call home. That's why our first budget invested $80 million in Nunavut alone, an additional $80 million for the families in Nunavut. And that's why we're going to work with other governments to make sure that every family in Nunavut included has a safe and affordable place to call home.
Hear, hear.
I would like to draw